For 13 days in October 1962, the world stood on a ledge, staring into nuclear fire. A handful of exhausted men in guarded rooms decided whether cities would live or vanish. And most people never knew how close the ending almost came. History often remembers crises as inevitable chapters, big forces grinding toward collision. But the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't inevitable. It was a chain reaction of fears, pride, miscalculations, and desperate attempts to feel safe in an unsafe world. One decision triggered another, and another, until the planet found itself holding its breath. The story really begins after World War II, when victory left two uneasy superpowers facing each other across a divided globe. On one side, the United States, wealthy, nuclear-armed, convinced it defended freedom. On the other, the Soviet Union, battered but powerful, determined never again to be invaded, and equally certain it represented history's future. Between them lay mistrust, ideology, and thousands of nuclear weapons pointed in both directions. By the late 1950s, nuclear weapons were no longer experimental horrors. They were strategy. Bombers sat on runways, missiles waited underground, submarines prowled oceans. Both sides insisted their arsenals preserved peace by making war unthinkable. The logic was brutal, but simple. If everyone could die, no one would start the fight. But strategy looks different depending on where you stand. In 1959, 90 miles from Florida, Cuba underwent a revolution. Fidel Castro's guerrilla fighters toppled dictator Fulgencio Batista. At first, Washington assumed Castro was just another Latin American strongman. Instead, he nationalized industries, confronted American corporations, and increasingly aligned with Moscow. To U.S. leaders, this was intolerable, a communist government in America's backyard. To Castro, the United States looked like a looming threat ready to crush his revolution. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy inherited a CIA-backed plan to invade Cuba using Cuban exiles. The Bay of Pigs invasion was supposed to spark an uprising. Instead, it collapsed in embarrassment within 3 days. Castro emerged stronger, Kennedy humiliated, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev took note. Cause and effect, always. Khrushchev saw a young American president who seemed cautious, maybe weak. He also saw something else: American nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy. Within striking distance of Soviet cities, the United States could hit Moscow in minutes. The Soviet Union had far fewer missiles capable of reaching America. So Khrushchev conceived a bold solution: place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. Close enough to threaten Washington, New York, and most of the United States. Suddenly, the strategic imbalance would disappear. From his perspective, it was defensive. From Washington's perspective, it would look like a loaded gun aimed at America's head. In the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began carrying troops, equipment, and missile components to Cuba. The operation was secret. Soldiers wore civilian clothes. Cargo was disguised as agricultural machinery. Soviet officials insisted everything was normal. Meanwhile, American intelligence suspected something but lacked proof. Until October 14th. That morning, a U-2 spy plane flew high over Cuba and photographed unmistakable evidence: Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. When analysts developed the film, they didn't celebrate their discovery. They felt dread. The missiles, once operational, could deliver nuclear warheads in minutes. On October 16th, President Kennedy was informed, and the clock started ticking. Inside the White House, Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, a group of advisors tasked with solving the crisis. Their options ranged from diplomacy to full invasion. Airstrikes seemed tempting. Destroy the missile sites before they became operational. Quick, decisive, except airstrikes wouldn't guarantee success. Some missiles might survive. Soviet personnel would die. Moscow could retaliate, perhaps in Berlin, where American and Soviet forces faced each other across a fragile divide. And if escalation continued, nuclear war. Another option: invade Cuba, remove Castro, remove the missiles. But invasion almost certainly meant killing Soviet troops already on the island. Khrushchev might feel compelled to respond militarily somewhere else. Again, escalation spiraled. Kennedy faced a dilemma every leader fears. Every move risked catastrophe. The solution chosen was something in between: a naval blockade, publicly called a quarantine, to prevent further weapons shipments. It was aggressive but not immediately violent. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation. Americans gathered around televisions as the president calmly revealed Soviet missiles in Cuba. He announced the quarantine and demanded removal of the weapons. Around the world, people listened with growing anxiety. Suddenly, nuclear war wasn't abstract strategy. It felt personal. In Moscow, Khrushchev received Kennedy's message. Soviet ships steamed toward the quarantine line, escorted by submarines. American warships moved to intercept. Two nuclear giants were now playing maritime chicken with the survival of humanity. For days, tension mounted. Would Soviet ships try to break through? Would American forces fire? Then, at the last moment, many Soviet vessels slowed or turned back. A small but crucial de-escalation. Both sides still faced each other, but the immediate collision was avoided. Yet the crisis was far from over. Missile construction in Cuba continued, and both governments prepared for the worst. U.S. nuclear forces went to DEFCON 2, one step below full nuclear war. Bombers sat armed and ready. Missile crews waited for orders they prayed would never come. Ordinary citizens stocked food, listened to news updates, and wondered if the future might end in radioactive fire. Children practiced duck and cover drills in school. Adults pretended calm while quietly fearing annihilation. Inside XCOM meetings, debates grew heated. Military leaders urged stronger action. Kennedy resisted, knowing escalation might slip beyond control. Meanwhile, communication between Washington and Moscow moved frustratingly slowly. Messages took hours, sometimes longer. Misinterpretation lurked everywhere. Then events nearly spun out of control. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter proposing a deal. The Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. The message sounded personal, almost desperate. Hope flickered. But the next day, a second message arrived, harsher, demanding removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey as part of any agreement. Now, Washington faced confusion. Which message represented Soviet intentions? Were hardliners taking control? Was time running out? And then came Black Saturday, October 27th, the most dangerous day of the crisis. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by Soviet air defenses, killing pilot Major Rudolf Anderson. Suddenly, American blood had been spilled. Military retaliation seemed likely. Simultaneously, another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska. Soviet fighters scrambled. American jets armed with nuclear missiles launched to escort the lost plane home. At sea, American ships dropped warning depth charges near Soviet submarines to force them to surface. Unbeknownst to the Americans, one submarine commander believed war might already have started. On-board submarine B-59, exhausted crew members endured suffocating heat and failing batteries. Communication with Moscow was lost. Depth charges exploded nearby. Captain Valentin Savitsky reportedly considered launching a nuclear torpedo. To fire, 3 officers needed to agree. 2 did. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued, persuaded, delayed. The submarine surfaced instead of firing. One man's restraint prevented nuclear escalation. History often hinges on moments no one sees. Back in Washington, Kennedy and his advisors searched desperately for a way out. They decided to publicly accept Khrushchev's first, softer offer, while secretly agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey. Later, on October 28th, Khrushchev announced the Soviet Union would dismantle and withdraw missiles from Cuba. The world exhaled. War had been avoided, not through triumph, but through compromise, caution, and sheer luck. In the aftermath, both leaders claimed victory. Kennedy showed resolve without war. Khrushchev secured a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and later removed American missiles from Turkey, even if quietly. But the crisis left scars. Kennedy recognized how easily events slipped beyond control. Khrushchev saw how dangerously close miscalculation had come to destroying both nations. A direct communication line, the famous hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. Arms control talks slowly followed, not because leaders trusted each other, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't. And perhaps that was the true lesson. Survival required cooperation, even among enemies. The crisis also changed how people viewed nuclear weapons. Until then, they were symbols of power. After October 1962, they felt like loaded dice rolling above humanity's head. Ironically, peace often depends not on heroes, but on restraint. Kennedy resisted military pressure. Khrushchev ultimately stepped back. Arkhipov said no. Countless officers followed orders carefully instead of impulsively. History is shaped not only by bold actions, but by decisions not to act. There's a quiet irony here. Both superpowers believed they were acting defensively, protecting their people, preserving balance. Each move meant to increase security instead made everyone less safe. It turns out that when two rivals try to feel invincible, they often end up terrified. The Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us that human beings, flawed, emotional, tired, proud, sit behind systems capable of ending civilization. Policies are made by people with families, fears, egos, and incomplete information. And sometimes, the world survives because someone pauses long enough to think. Today, the Cold War has ended, but nuclear weapons remain. New rivalries emerge. Old tensions persist. Technology moves faster than diplomacy. Decisions still happen in rooms where sleep-deprived officials weigh imperfect options. The lesson of those 13 days isn't simply that disaster was avoided. It's that catastrophe was never far away. Peace is not automatic. It is negotiated, fragile, and often invisible. In October 1962, the world stepped to the brink and stepped back, not because anyone won, but because everyone finally understood what losing would mean. And perhaps the most sobering thought is this: most people never knew how close the ending almost came. The sun rose each morning, traffic moved, children went to school, people argued about ordinary things. Meanwhile, in guarded rooms and silent submarines, the future balanced on human judgment. The crisis ended quietly. No victory parades, no triumphant speeches, just ships turning home, missiles dismantled, and leaders hoping the nightmare wouldn't return. But its legacy remains. A reminder that survival sometimes depends less on strength than on wisdom. 13 days. That's all it took to bring humanity to the edge, and mercifully, to remind it to step back. Because sometimes the bravest decision in history is choosing not to pull the trigger.